Good evening all and welcome to the 10th lecture of the National Conference. Today we have Dr. Burton Cleetus from JNU here. The moderator for today is Luqman al-Hakim. He is a PhD scholar of the department. He is working on mission, medicine and colonialism, institutionalization of medicinal practices in Malabar, 1834 to 1914. Over to you, Luqman, to take over the proceedings. Thank you. Luqman, can you hear me?
Ma'am. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. A very good evening and a warm welcome to everyone joining us for another session of the 7-day online national conference conducted by the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit College, in honor of Professor Paslithil and Dr. M.T. Narayanan on their retirement. The ongoing theme of this webinar is Critique and Construction, Contemporary Writing on Histories of Kerala. This webinar provides a platform to interact with the new generation of historians and social scientists working on Kerala's past, bringing forward a revised version of the existing assumptions and delving into fresh perspective and conceptualization. Today we have among us one of the most distinguished scholars, Dr. Burton Cleetus, faculty at the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, to enlighten us with his presentation titled Indigenous Medicine in Colonial Kerala, Text, Tradition and Practices. Before we begin, a few instructions for the participants. All the participants are requested to mute their audio and turn off their video throughout the session. Attendance of the participants will be recorded automatically. If any of the participants accidentally leave and are unable to rejoin the session, they can continue with us or live streaming in YouTube. Also, if you have any queries in between the session, please send them to the chat box or as comment in YouTube. And I will read it to the speaker on your behalf after the presentation. Without further delay, I will invite our PG student Kirti to formally introduce Dr. Burton Cleetus and for the welcome address. Kirti, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Once again, welcome to our 10th lecture of National Conference. It is my honor to introduce our chief guest and speaker, Dr. Burton Cleetus. He teaches at the Center of Historical Studies, JNU, New Delhi. He specializes in the history of medicine in colonial and post-independent India and has worked extensively on indigenous medical traditions in South India. Today, he talks on indigenous medicine in colonial Kerala, texts, traditions, and practices. With immense pleasure, I welcome Dr. Burton Cleetus to this lecture. Welcome, sir. And also, I would like to welcome all the participants to this conference. Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you for that warm welcome. And thank you, Professor K.M. Shriba, for inviting me to speak at the seminar series organized in honor of my dear friend, Professor M.T. Narayanan in particular, and Professor Paslithil. Thank you. Today I'll be speaking about indigenous medical traditions in Kerala, text traditions and practices. So before going into indigenous medical traditions, I would like to draw your attention to the whole idea about indigenous per se. So when we speak about indigenous, the whole notion about indigenous is something that practices that are essential to a land. Practices that are homegrown, something that is not really subjected to any kind of interaction. So we can really mark out certain societies as distinct. What makes a society distinct? Something that is totally unique to this land. So this is what we actually call as indigenous. So indigenous is, the whole idea about indigenous in that sense provides a certain kind of cultural fundamentalism. So when I'm speaking about indigenous medicine, the whole search is to see that medical traditions that are specific to Kerala. Of course, we all know that when we speak about Ayurveda is seen for years together. It is seen as something that has something that is very closely related to the identity of Kerala. Well, indigenous, though in its very nature and its very statement, it looks very innocent activity, something that is out there. The whole notion about indigenous is not so innocent in that sense. Rather, it grew out of a certain kind of political activity, of something that is deeply political in the whole notion of indigenous. The whole idea to separate societies in terms of, or to draw upon certain societies as having certain homegrown, certain essential cultural identities, came out of what you call as the nationalist movement. And so some came out of the interaction between colonized societies and colonial societies during the modern period. And for some reasons, given the current political scenario in this country, we know that the ruling dispensation at the present is trying to mark out clear distinction between the indigenous and the outsider. It's between what is ours versus the others. The cow is indigenous to everything that is indigenous, from the Aryan debate onwards. Attempts to identify and mark out things as the indigenous. So indigenous is political. Indigenous can also be a very dangerous term. So the history of medicine in Kerala, history of Ayurvedic medicine in Kerala also follows certain parallels. It is closely interlinked to modernity, is closely linked to the manner in which indigenous medicine has actually come into the stage. Ayurveda has actually emerged as the medicine, as the generic term of India in general and Kerala in particular. So one of the work that most of you might be familiar with is a work of Professor K.N. Panikar, who was my teacher, who taught in JNU, and also was the Vice Chancellor of your university. This work comes in the late 70s, 80s. He's written a small piece, an article about the Kottakkal Ayurvedishala. So when he was writing this particular piece, this follows from the earlier kind of historical writing into history being written in new terrains. New kinds of histories have been written. Students of history, you know that it's all started with the political history, with the history of a progress, positivist, when it had Marxist, different terrains into it. And in places like India, it was all nationalist history that was written. Then Panikar calls himself a Marxian nationalist, where he writes about this particular kind of a piece where he says that nationalism was not confined. That was the argument that he's putting forward. Nationalism was not confined to what you call as political, but you can actually find it in other domains, in the domain of medicine. And medicine was certainly one of the domains within which nationalism could actually be seen. And that Kottakkal Ayurvedishala, its protagonist, P.S. Warrior, was a nationalist in medicine. He was national. So when you say that, when you speak about nationalism, in that sense. For him, Vairya was somebody who was not a revivalist. He was, of course, partly who tried to revive medicine, but not fundamentalist in that sense. He was, of course, he did not really leave tradition to go to modern. Rather, he interacted with modernity, interacted with Western medicine in order to produce something new. And that was something that was necessary. A modern medicine, the modernization of Ayurveda was something that was necessary. And Ayurveda was in some sense remained stagnant. It remained without change over years, and it did not get modernized, and it remained in the 20th century. History of Kottakkal and history of Ayurveda was a history of modernization of Ayurveda, which was something that was necessary. So this is the history that this is something that is out there in Panikar's work, which is also mentioned in a few other works like Deepak Kumar and others who actually wrote about that. So there's a problem, or how do you read this? So the underlying logic about an article that Professor Panikar makes is that medicine is one. Medicine is universal, whether it's Western medicine, it shares, and that science is something that is rational. Science is also universal in character, and that when you rationally inquire into it, you actually find the truths. There is a truth that is unfolding. It follows a positivist logic towards unfolding of truth. So, what is Ayurveda? Is Ayurveda also based on a certain foundation, the same kind of foundation that Western medicine is survived? So we realize when we look into the text, particularly the work of Francis Zimmermann, he's an anthropologist from France. So he tries to look at the text, and he tries to make these classifications that Ayurvedic text classifies places, bodies, and so on. Then you have also other kinds of work of Stephen Engler, who makes this parallels between the cosmology of the cosmology of the world with the idea of the body, that both the universe is based on a cooking. The sun acts as a cooking, and that the body also is, there's a fire within the body, fire within the belly, which actually cooks the body cooks the food from one stage to another. So there is an epistemological binary between Western medicine and Ayurveda. Though, of course, you can find parallels in Greek medicine to the classical Ayurvedic text. Ayurveda is based on a different kind of a foundation. When you say that it is based on a different kind of a foundation, to what extent you can actually engage with Western medicine? Can we actually have the kind of researches that is going on in Ayurvedic colleges across the country? And if you actually follow some of these debates that were happening, or some of these government orders that has been coming over a period of time. Recently, the government of India allowed Ayurvedic doctors to conduct surgery. Then, of course, there's been huge funding towards trying to figure out the relationship between yoga and the brain, and how it can actually enhance brain cells. And all kinds of research, all kinds of fundings are actually going on. So the point is that, can Ayurveda become like Western medicine? Is it actually possible to do research into Ayurveda? So the paper that I'm trying to do is this history, what actually happened to Ayurvedic medicine over a period of time in Kerala, in Travancore in particular, and how did it actually evolve. So some of these available material from the 19th century points out that the term Ayurveda was actually not used to mark out all kinds of medicine in Ayurveda. It was not a generic term. There was some mention about Ayurvedic practitioners, and they say that this particular Ayurvedic practitioner was following mantra or mantra vaidyam or tantra vaidyam, or he had some atamuli or things like that, or he had kaipunyam. So if you identify a Vaidyan or some records in the 19th century, or even up to close to the mid 20th century, not at least 1950s and 60s, we have evidence where they say that they are specialized in Visha Chikalsa or Kandu Vaidyam, or all kinds of these kinds of things. And that some Ayurvedic Vaidyans say that, along with this, I also know Ashtankradeva. Vaidyam based on Ashtankradeva. So the Vaidyam based on Ashtankradeva was what you now call as Ayurveda. He had some idea about the text. So this is records until 1950 speaks in this way. So this has a history. The first attempts at trying to educate people in Ayurveda in Travancore come from the palace. It was the Travancore palace which actually stepped in to teach Sanskrit classical text to the people, the idea of people. The role of the palace is very significant because post 1857, across the 19th century, the princely states across this Indian subcontinent were losing politically to the British. They are losing their sovereignty to the British. And when the British had accepted, either annexed princely states or dominated over princely states as the major political sovereign, these princely states had to defend their political existence. And these political existence were defended on the basis of redefining what is called as indigence. The Travancore state emerged as a political establishment in the 19th century. This was a whole process. So before the emergence of Travancore as a major political establishment, the politics was organized differently, and that the responsibility, the king was answerable to the Brahman in a major way. Because the Brahman had a status which was defined in terms of the sacrificial fire, and as I earlier said, the fire had a major role in both in controlling the universe as well as the body, and that the Brahman had the power to control this fire. That's why you have the temple, and the temple is nothing but the center in which the fire was controlled, which was symbolic. It was symbolic in the way in which the world was controlled. And primarily because the world was controlled by the Brahmins, and that's what a priestly class is. It is also in a different way happens within Christianity. So the political authority was subservient to the Brahmins, but then the assertion of the political authority meant that the new educational institutions, new forms of regulations, new forms of surveying, new pedagogy was actually introduced. New kinds of an education system came to be introduced in the princely states, and of course at the national level. So one of the way in which, when this was actually introduced, the Travancore state was actually collecting information in the form of census, in form of any other kinds of ways, and that it, beyond the earlier order of caste, it was speaking in terms of the people. So when it was speaking in terms of the people, it also had to incorporate a variety of people into its own domain, and the palace opened its doors to not, even when they say about the people, it was to the Brahmin, to the Nayars, and of course a certain section of Iravas, which is supposed to be called the OBCs. The elite educated section was actually to give possibility to them. And that when this was happening, it extended, it revived traditions in music, in art, in Raja Ravivarma, we can see that. And there were people like Anandabrata Muthu Tambaran and Haripada Muthu Raja Varma. And so people associated with Travancore or with minor palaces, they learned Ayurveda, they became proponents of Ayurveda medical tradition, and that it was the first form in which it is actually taught to the people actually come from the palace. So, so this comes because there were two kinds of things. So on a larger level, the idea of the Hindu was coming into being. It was connected to the land. It was also connected to the medicine, and so on. So this also, those we are familiar with the Orientalist debates of the late 18th century, where the Asiatic Society was formed, and this text was revived from different parts of the subcontinent, and that text brought into print. The Ayurvedic text and any other kinds of Sanskrit text was brought into print, and this became popularized. So in this whole process, what was happening was the working of science. The science, as we know, it is something that happens in the laboratory. It's something that is more specified. But science was an ideology. Science was also manifested as an idea. So one of the idea, and one of the most prevailing idea, was about classifying and categorizing. So those who have read the work of Thomas Metcalfe, he speaks about what is called as a similarity and difference. Trying to figure out, so when you classify, the point is that you classify on the basis of the certain other kinds of things. You compare. You can't simply classify without being compared. So societies that were not really subjected to comparisons and classifications, slowly but steadily, the process of modernization meant was it was subjected to certain kinds of classification and comparisons. And when you classify and compare, of course, the Indian subcontinent is not exactly Europe. It is not even exactly, it is the other of Europe. Africa is other. So you have to again mark out Africa from India, India from Indonesia, India from Latin America. So these kinds of classification, even from within Europe, you have different kinds of classes. So this is how the world was mapped. A particular kind of a geography was mapped and marked across the globe in terms of people, in terms of bodies, in terms of cultural differences. So while marking out the subcontinent, one, they mark that there is something that is essential to the Indian subcontinent. And Orientalists like William Jones and others were particularly interested in this essential difference that marked out the Indian subcontinent as a distinct entity. And then you had this whole idea about tropical diseases, about tropics as being something different. And then one of the other things that they actually marked out was caste. So the problem is, once you categorize things and people, the categorization don't really end. You find new ways of categorizing. And one of the things that they came to India, they realized India is a subcontinent with its distinct, but then one of the most important thing is caste. It is organized hierarchy. It is in a pyramidal fashion. And that's Brahmins at the top, then you have caste down the ladder. And that when they marked out people on the basis of their caste hierarchies, they thought that these are not merely convenient ways of classifying. Rather, these classifications are real. And that is why the Anthropological Society of India was formed. When you say that the Anthropological Society of India was formed, the responsibility of the Anthropological Society was to go around meet people, measure their heights, measure their nose, that's what nosology is, or you measure the size of the nose, and that they measured the brain size. That means when you say there is a caste hierarchy, that caste hierarchy is writ large on the body of the people of the subcontinent. It's there. It's not some hypothetical assumption that have been made. That is real. That can be measured. That can be written. You can see the weight. The brain size of the Brahmin is larger than the brain size of a Dalit. That was the whole idea. So caste became a real. And when you make the caste, they're intellectually superior, and that the knowledge forms of the Brahmins are the predominant thing, the essential foundations of knowledge, and that all other kinds of knowledges that you find around are actually degenerated versions of the Brahmins. So if you know the Sanskrit text, if you know the essential principles of what is being mentioned through the classical Sanskrit text, you're able to understand the subcontinent. You are able to understand Indian society in terms of its cultures, in terms of the religion. You know the Sanskrit text, you know the religion, religion in its totality. You know Ayurvedic text, you know medical traditions in the subcontinent in its totality. So, so this was a colonial anthropological endeavor, and that the knowledge traditions of the Brahmins was recognized. When you recognize the knowledge traditions of the Brahmins as representing the medical traditions of the subcontinent, all other medical traditions became, by default, the degenerate versions of the Sanskrit texts and traditions. Everything had to be outlawed. So, this was a colonial endeavor. This was closely connected to the project of colonialism, closely connected to modernity and closely connected to the logics of science. So what happens is that from the colonized societies, they were operating on the basic foundations which colonialism had set. As Deepak Kumar argues and he writes that even in its rejection, even in its interaction, even in its rejection, the colonized accepted the basic arguments put forward by the colonizers. Even in its rejection of European medicine or science, you accepted the basic foundations of that. So you accepted the logic in which, not just in terms of science, in terms of a variety of other kinds of ways, the logic within which the colonialists had actually put forward. So, coming back to Travancore, the Travancore state, these are things that are happening over the late 18th into the 19th century. So we are speaking about the latter half of the 19th century, when the Travancore state was actually establishing itself as a political entity. And when Travancore state was establishing itself as a political entity, that assertion was closely connected, was resting on the foundations of what is called as indigenous traditions. And these indigenous traditions were forcefully introduced in Travancore. It was in terms of art, in terms of music, in terms of medicine. So, on the one hand, it was not just, when we say that it was forcefully introduced in tradition, it was not just introducing tradition, it was also establishing Western medical institutions, it was doing the bureaucratization of the administration, it was establishing schools, it was doing a variety of other kinds of things. So medicine was only one part of the whole story. But it was an important part of the story. So when it was establishing Ayurvedic schools, firstly, it taught people within the palace. And that so a new community of medicine of medical practitioners had suddenly emerged, who were grounded in Ayurvedic text, who knew Sanskrit text. And there were Sanskrit schools that were coming up across Travancore. So when Travancore, so there is this connection between medicine and Ayurvedic text, and Sanskrit became an important characteristics of what is called as indigenous medicine. But however, by 1896, the Ayurvedic Padashala was established. From the palace, it moved into a school. So when it moved into a school, the idea was that when all the texts were taught, so how do you arrive at a medical domain that is complete? In total, you are able to understand the bodies and diseases in its totality. You have to understand all kinds of disease. There is cure, because the starting premise was that the problem is that we are the therapy, the problems that are associated with indigenous healthcare traditions was primarily because, one, we moved away from the text. We have to regain those texts. And that because we moved away from the text, there was no scientific advancement. And that everything else, that the contemporary became a kind of quackery. The contemporary, what you call as contemporary, becomes quackery in that sense. So if you have to practice a scientific medicine, you have to move to the text. Professor Panikkar, whose article I mentioned in the beginning, so Panikkar's argument was that Kottakkal is the pioneer of medicine. Of course, they are the pioneers of indigenous medicine in Kerala. They are significant primarily because they are somebody who stood at a particular historical juncture in the closing decades of nationalism, from 1902 to 1944. He died in 1944. So the last phase of nationalism. So what was nationalism? Nationalism, we as those who are associated with secularism, the whole idea about secularism, tend to believe that the nationalist project was, though it was grounded in tradition, it was not communal. It was tradition, but it did not. It never went to the West. It was critical about the West. It was traditional, grounded in tradition, but not communal. So it's a very, very thin, razor-thin boundary that you're actually walking along. But you have in Travancore, it probably was happening in the latter part of the closing to the mid 20th century. But when it started off, the idea was that we wanted to create the Ayurvedic science of Ayurveda. But if you wanted to create the science of Ayurveda, you should learn, you should teach students all these Ayurvedic texts in its totality. And one of the criteria was that you admit students who have Sanskrit, knowledge about Sanskrit, into the Ayurvedic Padashalas. And it went on for a few years. However, within a period of 10 years itself, it was realized that it was not really working. It was not really working primarily because the Sanskrit was difficult to learn. It's not an easy language. People who admitted knew only the basics of language. Secondly, even if you learn all these texts, all these Ayurvedic texts, you're not able to understand, you're not able to make a clear distinction between what is the Vata, Pitta, Kapha and how the diseases are caused. You're not able to identify diseases in that sense. Because it was also at the same time, you have a wave of medical knowledge. You have the Western medicine is coming into being. It was the idea about the germ theory is prominent from the 1860s onwards. It has become a major issue. You have an anatomy that speaks about the body. You have a physiology, you have a pathology, you have the knowledge about the internal structures of the body. You have knowledge about all these things. And when you have all knowledge about all these things on the one hand, how do you explain diseases as is being enunciated through the classical Ayurvedic texts? So the Ayurvedic modernization process is not happening in a vacuum. It's not happening in a vacuum. It is happening at the same time that the Western medicine had actually made its presence and Western science had made its presence. So there is a constant interaction. The first idea was to insulate Ayurveda only with these texts. You just teach them. You just teach them the classical text, and then you have the ideal Ayurvedic tradition. By 1905, there were letters of communication that was happening in the archival files. You can come across different kinds of letters that is going on. And one of the major concerns was that you need to teach Western medicine also along with that. So the basic preliminary texts were taught, basic ideas were taught along with this. And when these basic texts were taught along with Ayurvedic texts, Western medicine was also introduced in Ayurvedic colleges. It created further problem. Means, is the body structured on the basis of what is being spoken in the Western medical, what we know, or is it something else as it's being spoken in the classical text? And then if you look at over years, this remained a recurring problem. There have been divide. There have been people who argue that let's not teach Western medicine because these are operating on two different epistemic premises. These are structured differently. You cannot merge together. There's been strong voices towards that. But then these are state-run institutions. Travancore Ayurvedic School, later converted into an Ayurvedic college, is a state-run institution. So when you say it's a state-run institution, the state state is on the one hand structuring itself as scientific, constantly calling itself as scientific, constantly calling itself as progressive and modern states. So the states, and a lot of these princely states, whether Travancore, Mysore, Baroda, Tanjavur, they're all modern progressive states because they embraced modernity in a big way. That's the whole idea that we come across. So when they embraced modernity in a big way and they were a modern state, they cannot really close their boundaries. They can close their doors to the arrival of new ideas, particularly the arrival of Western, the notion of the principles of Western medicine. You cannot insulate Ayurveda from that. So this was taught. This created further problem. But then there was something else that was actually happening along with this. Even when this crisis was prevailing, one was that the Travancore state stepped in to give grant and aid to institutions and scholarships to students. So what is a grant and aid after all? So grant and aid is basically to support an institution. So when you say that you support an institution, you also deny support to a group of other institutions. That's all. That is basically the objective of grant and aid. You basically say that these institutions and these people are unqualified. We don't recognize you. Basically, the idea is not to recognize. This whole objective is to say that we don't recognize you. You don't recognize your institutions. You don't recognize your practice. So the grant and aid is, and any grant is not a free lunch. All grants are always follows a lot of rules that you have to follow. A lot of it comes with a lot of rules basically. So what happens is that the grant and aid also comes in that way, where the Ayurvedic Vaidyasalas who were applying for grant or who were eligible for grant, were supposedly eligible for grant, was to, firstly, they had to function as the arm of the state. They have to follow the government rules from time to time. They have to keep a register of the patients who comes and goes. They have to prepare the list of medicines which they give to the patients. There, the Ayurvedic Shala or the Vaidya Shala it's not something in the Vaidyan's house, but you need to have a hospital. You need to have a clinic with one room, properly ventilated. The medicines have to be bottled, preserved, labeled, and kept. He also has to give the list of the kinds of disease that he cures in terms of cholera or the kinds of disease that were popular in Travancore at that point in time. So a whole series of restrictions actually follows. And then again, if the Travancore state is running a school, obviously the rule is that you need to have a degree from that school. You need to have some kind of a certificate from that school. So you need to know Sanskrit. You need to follow some kind of either earlier it was from the Padashala or later it was from the college, the degrees from the college. So it means that a lot of people were excluded from the grant. So the grant was in a means primarily aimed at the popularization of Sanskrit-based Ayurvedic medicine among the people. It is the only medicine that is recognized by Travancore. The Travancore state refuses to recognize a medical tradition that is not being taught in the Ayurvedic colleges, not a Sanskrit medicine, not Ashtakritam. So this created a lot of this. So when this came, there has been, again, of course, a lot of people applied, a lot of people who are not trained in the colleges put in the application for the grant to recognize the Vaidya. Because to get a grant was also, when you get a grant, you also get certain kinds of titles. You are entitled and you are recognized by the state, which became a very big thing at that point in time. So people collected signatures, people petitioned, and that when people petitioned, and people said, if you look at those petitions, they're quite interesting petitions when they said that, the Vaidyan who were practicing Vaidya, who don't really have Vaidya Shala, who was a practicing Vaidyan, had been practicing medicine for generations. His father and grandfather and his entire family were physician, we call it Vaidyan. They basically possessed an automuli, something that is hidden. We don't really know what exactly it is. Something that is hidden, a hidden quality in order to cure, and so on. And then the entire village actually signed and gave these petitions to the government. But it was largely rejected. Most of the cases they were rejected on the ground that he knows the art, that's fine, but he doesn't know the science of medicine. There is something called the science of Ayurveda. So the science of Ayurveda is basically the Ashtakritam text and the knowledge of Sanskrit text. And then there were constant inspections. People's grants were suspended. People were denied grants and so on. So this whole process through which Ayurveda was emerging through state patronage. And that some evidence we have, which also says that the kind of medicine that were practiced particularly in Travancore, I'm largely speaking about Travancore, were also called as Chindamani medicine. It's a broad thing. It had Tamil influence and so on. So Ayurveda was not really popular at that point in time. So, but the state never went back. The moment it actually stepped in to introduce the classical text or its absorption of Western medicine into the Ayurvedic colleges and practices, never went back. It is something that continues into the present. it is something that continues into the present, which is taught in the Ayurvedic colleges. If you look at the syllabus of any universities that are taught Ayurveda, most of these students are actually recruited from those who have actually gone through the +2, after the 10 +2, they write the entrance exams. Everybody want to go to MBBS and then dental, and then down the stream they get into Ayurvedic colleges. And it is Ayurveda is not that you don't get into Western medicine, you go into Ayurveda. Nobody does that. After agriculture and then after veterinary and after many things, it actually comes. The rank is actually lower. And even if they study, they for a few years they are introduced into both. They are introduced into Western medicine. They're taught Western medicine for a few years. They're also taught Ayurvedic medicine for some years. And then they become Ayurvedic doctors. They treat according to Western medical categories in terms of diagnosis. They use all kinds of equipments. They treat cancers and the manner in which diseases are always identified, also Western medicine, and so on. And the role of the Sanskrit is very, very important, primarily because without Sanskrit, how do you know Ayurveda? If a person like you or me doesn't know Sanskrit, it's fine, because though it is supposed to be the ancient language of this subcontinent, it's fine. But an Ayurvedic practitioner and an Ayurvedic student is supposed to know Sanskrit. But then they don't really know, because as all of us know, they come from +2 and so on. Then they have been taught at the Ayurvedic schools. So once when I was doing my research I happened to visit one of the Ayurvedic colleges in Kerala, and basically see the students and speak to the teachers and so on, field work. And then it was exam time. So it was exam time, and then I went into one of these hostel rooms where all these students are sitting in one particular room, and they were all hearing something. They were listening to something. That was what they did. Was the next day was a Sanskrit exam, and then the next day Sanskrit exam means they have to write in Sanskrit. So they don't know this is a language. It's like a compulsory language course that you have to pass. So what they did is that they recorded this Sanskrit songs, these slogans in the tune of popular Malayalam songs. And they recorded it so that it's easier to the tune, they can somehow pick it up. And then they all listened to these songs many times and got recorded, and they wrote the exams and they forget about it. So, but then Ayurveda is presented differently. What is happening at a ground level and what happens at a level of the nation is something else. Because there is an interest in Sanskrit, of course, interest in tradition, interest in the indigenous, as I started off with, and that indigenous is actually closely connected to the political, as I said. But as late as 1981, the census of India record says that the Sanskrit was spoken only by 14,000 people in this country. So Sanskrit was not a popular language. Sanskrit was spoken by not even all Brahmins, but a very section of Brahmins, because the Brahmin population itself is very high in this country. And in Kerala, it's less, but in places like Uttar Pradesh or Bihar, Bengal, Uttarakhand, and all these places in North India, they were quite high. So even among them, this language wasn't really a spoken language. But then Sanskrit becomes very significant. Sanskrit becomes very significant because it was closely interconnected to the realignment of power relation that was happening. Realignment of power relations that was happening within the subcontinent and within the princely states. So this also happened among the lower caste communities. The lower caste communities, particularly among the Sri Narayanan Guru tradition. So Sri Narayanan Guru was an Ayurvedic physician. He was also a Sanskrit scholar. He was also So he was also a social reformer, and so there's a multifaceted personality of different, and he is considered as the social reformer of Kerala. Is a main man, the protagonist of reform in Kerala. So most people would like to see him as a rebel, as a revolutionary, as someone who defied caste, and so on. When you look at these Ayurvedic engagements, I do not want to go into what was his activities at the level of the social, to what extent he was a revolutionary. That's a different story altogether. But if you look at his engagement with medicine, with Ayurveda, he was an Ayurvedic scholar. So when I say that he was an Ayurvedic scholar who learned Sanskrit. He was a Sanskrit scholar and he was an Ayurvedic teacher. And he knew the Ashtanga text and so on. Not only did he know all these things, he popularized it. He urged his community members to actually say that you should learn Sanskrit. And he started Ayurvedic Sanskrit schools. A lot of Sanskrit schools in Travancore is actually established by, which actually continues into the present, was established by Narayanan. And then he also he wanted his community members to change their social status, because how do you change your social status? Changing the social status is quite important. It's not so easy. So if you want to change your social status, you need to transform your social status. You cannot really do certain things. You have to do something else. So for him, changing the social condition means, of course, on the one level, he was critical of caste, that the caste is something that is oppressive in nature and something that cannot be accepted and so on. But on the other hand, he had a particular idea of the body. On the one hand, you critique somebody. That's how we always do. You critique somebody, but you also look towards yourself and say that what is the problem with me? Why am I at a lower level? He looked at his community members and said that basically that the lower situation is something that is also you need to engage in reform. You have to self-reform, and then you need to transform. So on the one hand, he said that you have to change. You have to change primarily because the bodies have to change. That means that the lower social condition is actually embedded within your own body. He urges community members, like, you restrict from eating meat. At times he also said, of course, we all know that he said that don't consume alcohol. Don't engage in the occupation of alcohol. So it was, when you say that don't consume alcohol, it was basically the idea that when you consume alcohol, the alcohol it has an effect on the body and it has a mind. It is not able to think rationally. You're not able to think rationally primarily because under the influence of alcohol. That's there. But he also said you don't eat meat. You also don't consume fish. Because his idea was that once you consume meat, once you consume fish, they actually has an influence on what is called as the bodily composition. The body becomes blocked because the mind is something that is connected to the body, and the inability to think rationally is actually the bodily conditions are actually stagnated. So, and then the reform movement took shape. And one of the arguments that the reform movement took forward was that Yadavas by tradition are actually Ayurvedic practitioners. This was the argument that they were putting forward. And that by the early decades of the 20th century, there was also the information about the Hortus Malabaricus coming in. The Hortus Malabaricus is a text. It was those who know about this, it's a 12-volume text. It's not an Ayurvedic text, but it's a compendium of plants in Malabar. It was written in Kochi, It was composed by the Dutch governor of Malabar by the name Hendrik van Reed. And that it basically, you can look at in your library, it basically has a description, as an illustration, as a Malayalam name, the Latin name, the Tamil name, and so on. It has uses, it's about describes the fruit and so on. So it's a little bit of medicinal knowledge. It has descriptions of the total plant. So what happens is that in the beginning there are four certificates, attestations by 3 Brahman Pandits and an Irava, and a Chogan. It is called not Irava, it's called as Chogan. There's a Siddhenka Bhatt, Vinaya Bhatt, and Apu Pandit are the 3 Brahmins, and the 4th certificate is by a person called Vityachudan. And he says that he's Chogan by caste, and is by tradition they were practicing Ayurveda. So for the Iravas, it becomes very significant because the Iravas said that, we are practitioners, we are basically medical practitioners by tradition. By tradition, one, we got it through the Buddhist tradition, where some Buddhist influence is very strong, and that our knowledge about our medical knowledge is actually recognized within this text. And somehow, over years, over the 20th century, if you look at the things that I've written about Hortus Indicus Malabaricus, including the one by K.S. Manilal, who was a botany professor of Calicut University. All these writings, either explicitly or by implicitly, it actually speaks that this text is basically an Ayurveda text, which is not really true. In the sense, like, we don't have, I'm not saying that it is not really true, I'm saying that we don't really have an evidence to say that this is, it is, of course, there is, 4 people have been collaborated in the making of this text. We just have a preface which says these 3 certificates that we were part of it. If it is an Irava text, it's equally a Brahmanical text. We don't really know. Or they might have really got. But this becomes a very important thing, primarily because to argue that, see that the Europeans have recognized Irava, and so that it points at the Iravas, even though they are lower in caste, they were Ayurvedic texts. Again, you go back to the text, go back to the preface, attestation given by Ityachudan. They don't say that they are Ayurvedic texts, Ayurvedic practitioners, followed by Sanskrit texts and Ashtadhyayi tradition. Medical, they were some kind of medicine that they practiced. So for a community that is actually striving for modernization, striving for reform, these things becomes very, very important. And that there was a big movement within the community to practice Ayurveda. A lot of people shifted their occupations. And we have instances and evidence, I found it from the archives, that sections of the Iravatis, it is also mentioned in the Census of India record that a community was engaged in there were barbers among the communities who actually shifted to Ayurveda and Sanskrit texts and so on. So which is not surprising, primarily because even in Europe, earlier it was surgeon barbers. It was barbers who actually shifted to surgeon. So when you say that it was barbers, they deal with knife. Sometimes they deal with the interment of the body. So for all these things, they have some idea about the body and so on and so on. So these kinds of shifts are actually happening. So what I'm trying to say is that on the one hand, you have the state trying to recognize, prioritize, encourage a particular version of the Sanskrit text, primarily because it is political in nature. Promote a particular version of the indigenous, primarily because it is indigenous. It is because it's connected to the state. It is connected to power. And then the response that is actually coming from what you call as a mass movement. The Irava movement was mass because it touched upon the people, and it was actually touching upon the lives of the people who were looking forward to transform their lives. And this whole process of transformation of their lives, you find it going along. On the one hand, you're critical about the caste system. There's a polemic against caste that was there. That was the underlying logic about nationalism, it was there. If you look at the actual practice, at least in the domain of medicine, you have more incorporating what is called a Sanskrit. There was no denial of the Sanskrit text. There was acceptance of the Sanskrit text. In fact, in order to accept, you make a claim, you make a legitimate claim and says that we were the ones, we were equally powerful, we were equally indebted, or we are part of the Sanskrit text because we came from a different tradition. We came through the Buddhism, and because Buddhism provided us we had a very strong Buddhist connections, and so that basically the Buddhist connection that the Yidavas were trying to point was to argue that you might be caste-wise, you might be lower. In terms of caste hierarchy, you might be lower, but in terms of intellectual traditions, you're not lower. You're equally part of the classical Sanskrit text. So what happens is that the promotion of Sanskrit text that was happening, the promotion of a Sanskritized medical tradition that was happening in Turkey, and the marginalization of non-Sanskrit text that was happening, was happening on the one hand, it was happening at the level of the state. Of course, we can understand that the state promoting a particular kind of version, but on the other, it was this reform was also connected to this kind of a marginalization, and that this so reform is basically about you get rid of a lot of things and you become part of upper caste practices. So this is what Srinivasan writes in his famous ideas about Sanskrit. It is also mentioned even before Srinivas wrote about it in the 50s and 60s. It is there in the census records. It's there in the census records in 1910, in 1920, in 1911, 1921, 1931. In 1931 census says that lower caste communities basically has a desire to absorb, accept upper caste practices and so on. It's something that is a pan-Indian phenomenon and so on. So, so what I basically was trying to say, that the indigenous medical modern, what is indigenous medicine in that sense? So this had an impact on indigenous medicine. If you look at 1921, there is a Usman Committee report from 1921. He draws upon there was largely he basically tries and understand the diseases, and he says that diseases largely were understood and classified and explained in terms of fevers. There were different ways of understanding fevers and so on. That's a kind of medicine that was prevalent in the local level. But over years, these kinds of centralization, this institutionalization, and the domination of Ayurveda as a single entity, to a large extent, undermine local practices. And that when you speak about indigenous, the indigenous becomes, indigenous in a certain sense becomes Ayurveda. And that indigenous is not just away from power, not just away from politics, it is closely linked to the working of power relations within a society. But you can see at various levels. It can see at various levels, and how does it work? In terms, for example, if I'm a Christian and if you speak about the Christianity remains outside. It's always the very fact that you remain Christian, it always remains outside. Or if you look at Islam, that you remains outside. But then Christianity came 2000 years back and somehow or the other. And that it became part of the evidence says that the coconut comes in the 5th or 6th century AD. That means it comes before coconut. And Islam comes roughly in the 6th or 7th centuries. But then, knowingly or unknowingly, this whole process of category, it is of course, it is a deliberate, you can call it a communalization and things that are happening. But it's not just a communalization that is happening now, but the very process of modernization has been marking out certain things as indigenous and marking. And when you mark something as indigenous, you do exclusions at two levels. On the one hand, you exclude a lot of people as outsiders, that is Western, but you also mark out and exclude certain people at the local level as who are in confrontation, who are also outsiders, who basically are an attack or a threat on what is the essential indigenous. So, so the indigenous is something that is in between the West, India, that is the outsider, but you are also marking out somebody, the outsider from within, somebody who does not qualify to be called the essential indigenous. So the history of Ayurveda in that sense is basically a history of exclusion, a history within which is closely interconnected to the making of modern societies within the Indian subcontinent. Thank you.
Lukman, are you there? Can you start with the discussions? Lukman?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much for this informative lecture. It was indeed very engaging to learn more about the indigenous medicines in colonial Kerala. It was also interesting. The point of colonized Travancore society accepted the colonizers' medicines. At the same time, Travancore state himself tried to make modernization of indigenous Ayurveda medicines during the time of colonial and post-colonial period. Now the session is open for discussion. Please post your queries and comments in the chat box. We have a few questions in the chat box. Let me read the questions, sir.
Yes, please do that.
The first question we have from is Jayanti Chami. How far the indigenous medicine different from traditional medicine or tribal medicine today?
If you look at, this is a question that has come many times. What is this tribal medicine that is different from what is called as indigenous medicine? So if you look at the caste categorization, communities that formed within a system where people who are actually integrated into caste in the 19th and the 20th, in the 19th and the 20th century. So the kind of development that I was discussing were taking place at the domain of caste. So, for example, it was something that was happening between the state, between Sanskrit knowledge, Iravas, and lower caste groups. But tribes was something that was different. So what you find as tribal knowledge, it points to the fact that even among Iravas, even among other communities, these kinds of medical knowledges were there in the late 19th, 20th centuries. What you identify as tribal knowledge is something that is not something tribal, When you say that it's tribal knowledge, the first idea is that it's something that is different from Sanskrit knowledge. It's something that is different from the mainstream Ayurveda. It's very peculiar. They have some gifts. They have some mystic medicine. That's the whole idea. This is exactly that the archive speaks. Each Vaidyan within localities, the people say, the Vaidyan himself gives representation. I possess some kind of medicine. I have a Atamuli, and people say that he has an Atamuli. He has been practiced medicine. He has divine qualities. He's a Divyan. He's both a priest and a medic. So this is what it's popular everywhere. But what happens is that tribes, for some reason, remained outside the purview of the state, remained outside what is called as a social reform process that we discussed. So their medicine remained as something that is frozen in time. You can see this is tribal medicine, that is different. And we also have now that, now the search for the indigenous is there. As Immanuel Kant says, that the truth is best heard from the mouth of the fools, as Francis Rabelais says. So you find the truth within the lowest, and tribes are something that is, people would like to take a vehicle to Wayanad and see the Kuruva tribe there. There is because you look for you somehow made the tribes to be frozen in time. They're there. That's how this desire for the what is also called as a tribal medicine comes in.
So next question from Minu Rebecca. How do you perceive the construct of Kerala Ayurveda, a successfully traded concept, although Ayurveda traces back its legacies to the Sanskrit texts which are from the north?
No. So I would always say that the revival and reform and institutionalization of Ayurveda is closely interlinked to what is called as modernities, are mostly connected to the introduction of Western science and medicine in any part of the country. So, and that Kerala is the place where modernization had happened in a major way across time, and particularly after the Christian missionaries and so on and so forth. So the response to that and the institutionalization of Ayurveda happens as a response and happens as a byproduct of these kinds of changes that happens during the time of colonialism. So it is quite natural that Ayurveda becomes as a center because there was the reform and revival and institutionalization comes from this kind of a relationship. So your question is that Kerala is the space of Ayurveda. Yes, it is the space of Ayurveda, but that the space of Ayurveda, it's, as I said, it marginalized a lot of other kinds of medical traditions. Even in a pan-India level, there were all kinds of medical traditions in Tamil Nadu and everywhere, every community, because medicine is something that is very close to the body. So medical traditions exist everywhere. But then the question is, why is it that Ayurveda emerged? Because Ayurveda emerged over a period of time, as I said, because it's closely connected to the interaction with what you call as modernity, but also it had also had something to do with the tourism industry and so on, where the government initiative in order to promote Kerala as the Ayurvedic destination. So all these things, and of course the Kottakkal. If you look, I didn't speak about the Kottakkal history and migration, which is a different story altogether. So that all these developments helped in emerging Ayurveda as the destination. Any more questions? Any more questions, Lukman?
Yes, there are questions. Maybe Lukman's call has dropped. The next question is how is the term Ayurveda in the sense that we understand it today?
How is the?
How old is the term Ayurveda in the sense that we understand it today?
We don't really come across, of course, there is in government records, you find the term Ayurveda that is mentioned in the late 19th century and so on, but mostly it is written as Ashtang Hridayam text. Ashtang Hridayam Vaidyam, that's what it has been constantly mentioned. And some of the Vaidyams, as I said, that they say that, I know Tantram, Mantram, Vaidyam, Vatamuli, Taipunyam, and Ashtang Hridayam Vaidyam. So the constant reference in the 1920s and 30s were basically Ashtang Hridaya Vaidyam. And so, of course, we know that Ashtang Hridaya Vaidyam is the one that is actually spoken as, because Ashtang Hridayam is a text that has been spoken and which actually emerges as Ayurveda. But I think the popularization of the term had a lot to do with the post-independent era, because the post-independent India was basically promoting the nationalist state, and when nationalist state was being promoted, they of course had to have a word. There's some terms, they promoted certain kinds of things. So it is only in the post 1950s that this term actually becomes a very prominent term, which was not really there even in the 1930s and 40s.
Thank you. The next question is from Jayanti Chami. The traditional medicine is passed from one generation to another, though Ayurveda as a discipline today, through Ayurveda as a discipline today, what is the difference between traditional Ayurveda with disciplinary Ayurveda?
The point that I was trying to make is that the tradition itself was in a major way promoted, major way revived and created. That's the whole point that I was trying to do. So if you're looking at traditional Ayurveda that has been passed on to one generation to another, there are, and when you say that it is a traditional Ayurveda that is passed on one generation to another, if you are speaking about the classical text that's been passed on to one generation to another, of course, this transfer of text, Sanskrit text within Brahmin families is something that happened, including Ayurveda, among various other kinds of texts. And these happened within generations. So of course, you know, it happens within the family. And that it was not just in Ayurveda in terms of all other kinds of medicines. Generally, it is from fathers to son. It's a family way it has been transformed. So the question was that it was how does it differ from the modern Ayurveda? Isn't it so? What was the question? Was it how is it different from the modern that has been taught in Ayurveda colleges or something? Isn't it? Hello.
Yeah, the traditional, the difference between traditional Ayurveda with what has been taught as a discipline.
Yeah, of course it is there. The problem is that if you say about traditional Ayurveda, if it is taught in the families, they can have the liberty to teach the text, you know, but in a disciplinary way, discipline is a college. It's an Ayurveda college, and when you say it's an Ayurveda college, it has to teach certain things. And it is when you say it is a college, and if you say that okay, we are teaching medicine, and when you teach it is medicine, you say that you need to know the body, you need to know the cells, you need to have the laboratory, you need to speak in terms of a language that is about diabetes and cholesterol and so on. So if you go to an Ayurvedic college and if you say that I have heart pain, of course the patient himself is saying that in terms of heart pain. The doctor knows that the patient speaks. So the doctor also says, go and take a scan. It passes through all the kinds of things. And that comes up with a different diet and so on. But then the doctor knows that there's a heart. So, for example, if you look at the biography of P.S. Vairya, he says that some of these texts, what is said in the classical text, does not really stand. It is not based on any kind of logic. For example, in the classical text, the heart is mentioned as an inverted lotus. How can a heart be an inverted lotus? If the heart is an inverted lotus, the blood will flow down into the body. So it cannot be an inverted lotus. It is basically, as I said, it is said in the, according to, the heart is different. Basically, it doesn't say that it's according to, the heart is different. Heart is there, that we see the heart. You can operate the heart. The heart is a heart. It's not an inverted lotus. So the Ayurvedic college students, it doesn't say that heart is an inverted lotus. Heart is heart. So they know it according to the modern rationalities. So according to modern rationalities, when you have been taught all these things and how do they arrive at the balance between the humors? This was a problem. So, but then in its archival files, it's constantly been said that let them realize, let them learn both, and let them arrive at the conclusion. Because science is universal, and science they cannot be one knowledge, and so on. So when the crisis occurs, the problem is that let them learn both, and when they learn both, they will be able to understand both better. So this was the whole idea, and they left it there. There was no conclusion, and this problem persists from from the late 19th century onwards, the entire 150 years, this whole issue about how to resolve this binary between Western medicine and Ayurveda, it continues into the present. And there's no answer. That's not going to be resolved at all.
The next question from Razia Irsad. What is the traditional practices of Ayurveda?
What is the
traditional practice of Ayurveda?
I don't know. I think she has to frame the question a little differently. Traditional practices of Ayurveda, I didn't quite understand what she actually wanted to ask. Could she ask what is?
Okay, next question from Sanu PC. Colonialism viewed diseases such as leprosy that
colonialism. Little slowly, Sanu. Little slowly.
Colonialism diseases such as leprosy that spread from one person to another with great apprehension. Many of these diseases were later diagnosed and treated, even in Europe. But in the early stages of colonialism, the notion of the tropics as landscape of dreaded ill health.
Notion of the I can't sometimes hear, Notion of early stages of colonialism.
Notion of the tropics as landscape of dreaded ill health prevailed. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, I have written an article in EPW related to this recently, so you could read that. Because as I said that the tropics were seen as the disease, as a space of disease. So when they encountered the tropics, most of these disease theories were based on what the Europeans wanted to understand, what the Europeans thought about it, right? So if you say that the bodies are not the same, if the bodies are different, it is if the bodies are different, what shapes the bodies? The bodies are basically shaped by the environment and the climate. So people within the tropics are people whose bodies are shaped by the tropics. When you say that the tropics shapes the bodies, the tropics are a space for putrefaction. That means there is foliage, there is decomposition, putrefies, there is impure air, you inhale impure air, and when you inhale impure air, there is less oxygen in the lungs because you are inhaling impure air. And then because there is less oxygen in the lungs, there is internal hemorrhage, the blood flows into the body, and then the blood goes into the body and goes out of the body. And because there is a constant loss of blood, you become anemic, and because you become anemic, you're not able to think. So this is a sequence in which the body was structured at the top. So what the Europeans, when they come suddenly, they can't really stand the tropics, they will die. So all these medical theories comes because the Europeans were coming and dying here. And that the Indians don't die because they are used to it. But even if the Indians don't die, what happens is that because of the constant loss of blood, because they are constantly anemic, they are anemic, they produce, their children becomes anemic, their generations of anemic. And because you are anemic, you can't think. And because you can't think, all your cultural practice, all your religious practices, or what you call as Oriental despotism, the despotic practices within the family and within the state, they're all manifestations of a community that is unable to think rationally. So the tropics becomes tropic was a medical explanation to define the people. And tropics becomes, the whole idea of the tropical medicine becomes dominated European thought for years together, for centuries together. Please read if you are interested. You can read that out. You can Google it. It is available online.
Next question.
Next question was from Anup. There have been studies in Malabar on the persistence of caste and religious consciousness during the colonial period. How did modern medicine negotiated with this pressure from colonized space?
There was caste and religious pressures, and how did medicine negotiate? Is that what?
Yeah.
Could you just tell me, let me know once again, what is that question after all?
Okay. There has been studies in Malabar on the persistence of caste and religious consciousness during the colonial period.
Okay.
How did modern medicine negotiated with this pressure from colonized spaces?
What had medicine to do with all these castes? That's what the question is, I think. Is it about modern medicine or about traditional medicine? What exactly is it?
Modern medicine.
Okay. Of course, modern medicine, not just in Malabar, but gave space, was a leveling factor. It gave, with the emergence of what is called as the public domain, caste boundaries, people were able to go to hospitals, and caste boundaries were often breached, and so on. So this is a history of modernization in everywhere, particularly in Kerala, that modernity gave new spaces, institutions of modernity, including education and healthcare, gave new spaces, new opportunities for lower caste communities to improve their social conditions, which you actually find compared to other places, compared to North, compared to many other places. Kerala is what you call as modernity certainly gave space to lower caste communities in a big way. There's no doubt about it.
Next question from Preeti George. Was Ayurveda exclusively practiced by men? In the process of modernization, was the Western practices of nursing adopted in Vaidyashalas and Ayurveda hospitals?
Yes, it was. Western medicine practices were adopted. You should visit an Ayurvedic college and see how it is actually happening there. It is not immune to, because the problem is that students also comes from people who have got a particular kind of a marks. They get admission after +2. They because even when we are all trained in schools, we all have an idea about what. When you speak about the body, immediately the anatomy comes, physiology comes. So, and then you have been till +2, and these are science students from science streams. They join the Ayurvedic colleges, and then it's a little difficult to say that the body, according to Ayurveda, what you consume, what you eat, actually transformed into 7 dhadus. Right? It transformed from one stage to another, to blood, to chyme, to flesh, and the final stage is the 6th stage is sperm, and then you have ojas, such as a mystic thing. So it's a little difficult to actually imagine that. But then you're learning in Ayurvedic colleges. So how do you go? But then there are possibilities of understanding certain medicine, certain plants and certain drugs could be used to help the body and so on. So then Ayurveda is also actually working on this principle that meat cannot be consumed. Meat is the vegetarian, it's a vegetarian diet will actually happen in the body. So it also falls into an essential body which is close to nature and so on. So this crisis is there. It's not that all the crisis needs to be sorted out and solved. It won't be solved, Some crisis remains. It simply continues. That's it.
The next question from Kavi Arasan. Was it any response by marginalized physicians who practiced based on religious text? Like how Siddha medicine emerged against Sanskrit-centric Ayurveda?
Yeah. No, it is. It is because, as I said, that because it was connected to the power relations, there was particularly in Tamil Nadu, there's this movement, the Tamil identity and Tamil nationalism was in the emergence of Siddha medicine. And then if you look at there is a lot of parallels between Siddha medicine and Ayurveda, and that the emergence of Siddha medicine as a distinct entity was also to try and separate itself from Ayurveda and say that, see, we have a different and distinct tradition. It also happens between Unani and Ayurveda. Though there are all crossovers in the early late 19th century, there were lots of parallels, but the kind of issues that are not really medical in that sense, there are social and there are political, there are issues related to identity. They had a major influence in marking out medicines and separating itself from other kinds of medicines. So this is something that is actually happening.
Next question from Anish R. We have an excellent history of the making of Ayurveda under colonial modernity. Kottakkal Aryavaidya is a classical case. However, the low-caste Iyava was left to Sanskritized rather than allowed to fashion their modern self under colonialism as Ayurvedic practitioners. Why did it happen in this way?
See, that is what I'm saying, that lower caste communities, they don't really, if you look at Tamil, of course, there is a Tamil nationalist identity that is coming into being and so on. That's why it actually separates itself. So, again, when you're speaking about Irava, the Irava medicine, there is a lot of Tamil influence that is there. But over a period of time, the whole process of institution, the whole movement towards social reform, means that you actually practice, you actually incorporate practices that are Sanskrit in nature. That's how it went. Because when you say about reform, the word reform means that you separate yourself from, you're reforming. You're reforming means you're changing. You're changing into something new. To transform. And when you say that you're transformed, means you certainly transform from a certain kind of a behavioral practices, certain kind of lifestyle into certain new. So what was it? It was a view, it was a movement from one way of life to another. And of course, we all know that, Sri Narayanan Guru clearly said that don't consume alcohol. So when he says that don't consume alcohol, of course, is not something that is nobody advises to consume. But then he had an idea that when you consume alcohol, it had a change in the body. It influences the bodies. It not only Ayurveda, it not only alcohol. If you consume meat, it has an influence on the body. If you consume fish, the ideal thing for him was to be a vegetarian. The vegetarian the body doesn't get energy. The body gets overheated. The body doesn't get blocked, because the whole idea was that if you consume meat, consume things that are not necessarily needed for the body gets blocked, and that falls to ailments. That's a sin. That's something that is you are inflicting on your own body, and including sex. Sri Narayanan Guru was a yogi. If you look at his biography, he says that he married so something is there, some connection with women. He married, okay, but then he left. We don't know anything about his wife, and he became a yogi because sex was something that is sin. What about again P.S. Varier? P.S. Varier has also some story to say, some association, but later just left. He remained a bachelor. Why are they? What is it that driving people to say that sex is something that is a sin? Because that was even Gandhi's experiments with his whole body, how he can actually restrict from sex and so on and so forth. So sex was considered as a major sin. If you look at a lot of these records in Kerala, Ayurvedic records, people say that, for example, the 7th stage is Ojas. I just mentioned, the 7th stage of the Dadu is Ojas. The 6th is sperm, Shukla. It's basically sperm. So Ojas is the vital energy. That is an idea. We don't know what exactly it is. So the patients constantly say that I lost my vital energy, I lost my Ojas. So how did you lose your Ojas? Because of drinking, but the primary concern was that having sex with outside marriage or multiple women. And that they say that the ojas, I saw ojas going out of urine in a white. So the ojas is also, it's basically the sperm is being going out of urine. The body becomes weak, the body becomes anemic, and so on. So when you say that ojas, it's also bodily. It is also in terms of making a pure body. When you say that a pure body, a lot of things become impure. Many things becomes impure. So this is exactly that was happening. So why is it? You need to ask this question. Why is it all the social reform movements and a lot of political leaders, they didn't marry or they did not really speak about sex, because sex was something, pleasure is something, they wanted to distance themselves from pleasure. They wanted to distance themselves from eating meat. Ayurveda speaks about meat, speaks about eating, consumption of meat. So why is it that suddenly this whole obsession with vegetarianism comes into being? So these are things, these are ways in which it's not, so we are living in a society that is not just pure. We should primarily recognize that we basically are also living in an impure world, and its impurity is not really a problem. If a sex is impure, it's impure. We're living in a world in which all kinds of, all kinds of things exist. And this, even when a lot of people are, they call us secularists, also critical about things that are happening at a national level. But then they're also trying to create something sane, something that is pure, something that is essential, something that is ideal. So the more and more you go towards an ideal, more towards an essential, it's dangerous. It did not become dangerous because it was happening at the time of national movement. And certainly what is happening in the present has its roots in that's what I'm trying to say. It has its root in the last 100 years or so. It is there. It is part of the national movement. It is there in the social movement. It is there in things that you identify as the great, as the essential thing. These went together. These are part of it. These are part of the stories. What you see in the present is actually part of a story that has been unfolding for the last 150 years or so.
Hopefully, this is the last question for the session by Mahendra Jaiswal. Question is, what is folk medicine?
As I said, that we can't really, the point is that this separation comes because something is left behind. Because Ayurveda has dominated in a major way, that something is left behind is folk medicine. But if you look back, a lot of things existed like this, as heterogeneous medicines scattered over places, which you actually can see. Because when you say that what is folk medicine, there is medicine, there is this dominant Ayurveda everywhere. You can have a small folk medicine somewhere or there. But 100 years back, Ayurveda was what is called as Ashtanga medicine was something that was like folk medicine, which is so marginalized, and that what you call as folk was the dominant. So there is an inversion of roles that is happening now. I think the questions are over.
Okay, thank you, sir. It was indeed a wonderful discussion. Thank you, sir, for answering all the questions so patiently. Now, I would like to Amruta, or research scholar, for the vote of thanks. Over to you, Amruta.
Thank you. Good evening to all. I feel honored having an opportunity to offer vote of thanks on this occasion. We are grateful to Dr. Burton Cleetus for expressing views on the topic Indigenous Medicine in Colonial Kerala, Texts, Traditions and Practices. On the behalf of Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, I express my sincere gratitude to you, sir, for making the session highly informative. Thank you, sir. Next, I extend my sincere gratitude to all the participants. Thank you, all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Burton, for that very informative session. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you all participants for joining us again today for the 10th lecture. We meet again tomorrow.